By 1868, much of the samurai class was under acute financial pressure. Not from war, not from foreign invasion, from debt. At the height of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan's warrior elite controlled land, law, and the right to carry two swords. They were among the most formidable fighting forces in the world. But for over 2 centuries, their official income was tied to rice stipends, and rice does not pay rent in a city. So the samurai borrowed. They borrowed from merchants, the lowest social class in feudal Japan, people so marginalized that official Confucian doctrine ranked them below farmers and artisans. And they kept borrowing, year after year, generation after generation, until the debt became impossible to escape. This is not a story about military defeat. It is a story about how one of history's most formidable warrior classes was undermined by debt, inflation, and the logic of compounding obligations, forces they were never fully equipped to counter. Welcome to Financial Origins, where we trace the economic forces that shaped civilizations and reshaped empires. Today, we follow the money inside feudal Japan. The story of the samurai's financial collapse is not well known outside academic circles. Most people encounter the samurai through the lens of discipline and martial tradition. But beneath that image lies a structural economic crisis that unfolded across 2.5 centuries, one that transformed the social architecture of an entire nation without a single major battle. To understand what happened, you first need to understand the unusual economy of the Edo period. Japan was not a primitive society. By the 1700s, Edo, modern-day Tokyo, was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population exceeding 1 million people. The country had sophisticated trade networks, a flourishing arts culture, and a vibrant urban economy. But this entire civilization was built on a foundation that was, in economic terms, deeply fragile: rice. Rice in Tokugawa Japan was not just a food crop. It was the principal fiscal unit and measure of domain wealth. Taxes were assessed in rice. Stipends were paid in rice. The power and prestige of a feudal domain was measured in koku, a unit equal to roughly 180 liters of rice, considered enough to feed one person for 1 year. A domain worth 10,000 koku was not just a statement about agriculture. It was a statement about military capacity, political rank, and social standing. Meanwhile, the urban economy of cities like Edo and Osaka already operated largely on coined money, creating a growing divide between how elite incomes were measured and how daily life was actually paid for. The samurai, as the administrative and warrior class, received their official stipends within this system. Their income was denominated in koku, and for a society based in isolated rural domains, this worked reasonably well. But the Edo period brought something those domains had never fully anticipated: 250 years of enforced peace. The Tokugawa shogunate came to power after the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, a conflict that ended a century of near-constant civil war and unified Japan under the Tokugawa family. The founding shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and his successors, built a political system specifically designed to prevent any future rival from accumulating enough power to challenge the central government. This system was called the Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance policy. Every major feudal lord, the daimyo, was required to spend alternating years in his home domain and at the shogunal capital in Edo. When he returned home, his family stayed in Edo as political guarantors of loyalty. This policy had one intended effect and one catastrophic unintended consequence. The intended effect was political control. The daimyo were kept perpetually traveling, perpetually spending, and perpetually separated from their families. It was difficult to organize a serious challenge to the central government while you were halfway across Japan on a mandatory procession. The unintended consequence was economic strain on a structural scale. These annual journeys were elaborate public ceremonies. The size of a daimyo's procession was a direct statement of his rank. Hundreds of retainers, porters, and attendants were required. Accommodations along the road had to be paid for. 2 residences, one in Edo, one at home, had to be maintained simultaneously. The costs were enormous, and it was not only the daimyo who suffered. The samurai retainers who accompanied them were expected to maintain appearances. Urban life in Edo demanded clothing, entertainment and social expenditures that a rice stipend, calculated in rural terms during a rural era, could not cover. The samurai class had migrated from the countryside to the city, but their income had not followed. This is where the financial mechanism becomes specific enough to trace. The first pressure was the rice-to-cash conversion problem. A samurai's stipend was paid in rice, but his expenses were paid in cash. To access his own income, he had to sell rice on the open market. This required the services of rice brokers, primarily based in the commercial city of Osaka. These brokers charged fees, and the market price of rice fluctuated constantly. In years of good harvest, rice was abundant and cheap. A samurai who needed to convert 10 koku of rice into cash might find that year's harvest had significantly reduced what those 10 koku could purchase in coin. His nominal salary remained the same. His real purchasing power dropped. The second pressure was the advance system. Because the rice harvest came only once a year but expenses arrived every month, samurai routinely needed cash before their stipends were paid. Brokers and merchants offered advances, essentially short-term loans backed by future rice deliveries. At first, these advances seemed manageable. In practice, they became the foundation of permanent debt. Each year's advance had to be repaid from the next year's harvest, which often meant taking out another advance to cover living costs in the meantime. The cycle was self-reinforcing. The third pressure came from the structure of lending itself. The merchants who extended these loans occupied the lowest official rank in the Tokugawa social hierarchy. Under the Confucian framework that structured Japanese society, the order ran from samurai at the top, then farmers, then artisans, then merchants at the bottom. Because merchants were seen as people who created no direct value, only profited from exchange. In practice, this social contempt masked an economic reality. The merchants had the capital. Interest rates on loans to samurai and daimyo were substantial. Rates were often around 15% annually, and the financial burden became severe when loans were rolled over repeatedly year after year, which, for many borrowers, was precisely what happened. The weight was not just in the rate. It was in the relentlessness of obligations that were never fully cleared. The fourth pressure was the daimyo debt spiral. It was not only individual samurai who borrowed. The feudal lords themselves ran their domains on credit. Merchant houses such as the Konoike family, who rose from regional sake production to become major financial intermediaries for daimyo, were central to this system. By the 18th century, many domains were trapped in debt structures that were extremely difficult to retire, paying recurring obligations on balances that had accumulated over decades. The fifth pressure was the repeated failure of reform. The Tokugawa government was not unaware of the problem. The Kyoho reforms of the 1720s under Shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune addressed fiscal austerity, domain finances, rice price stability, and broader economic discipline. The Kansei reforms of the 1790s pursued similar aims. None of these efforts resolved the structural imbalance. They temporarily relieved pressure, but the underlying mechanism, a rice-based salary system operating inside a cash-based urban economy, remained unchanged. Within years, the pressures would rebuild. The sixth pressure was psychological, and it operated in parallel with the financial one. For the samurai, debt was not merely an economic condition, it was a profound social disruption. To be indebted to a merchant, a man who occupied the lowest rung of the official social hierarchy, inverted the moral order of feudal Japan in ways that were difficult to absorb. The ruling class was becoming financially dependent on the class it had historically looked down upon. That inversion had political consequences that extended far beyond individual balance sheets. The seventh and final pressure was structural erosion. By the late Edo period, many samurai saw their stipends reduced, delayed, or effectively weakened in purchasing power as cash-strapped daimyo tried to balance their own accounts. Some samurai even sold future stipend rights for immediate cash, trading away tomorrow's income to survive today. The warrior class was quietly liquidating itself. The scale of this wealth transfer becomes visible when you look at what happened to the merchant class in parallel. While the samurai were shedding assets and income, the great merchant houses of Osaka and Edo were accumulating capital at a rate that had no precedent in Japanese history. The Mitsui family, who began as sake and miso merchants in the 17th century, evolved into money changers, and eventually into one of the largest commercial and financial operations in Asia, a lineage that became part of the foundation of the modern Mitsui conglomerate. The Konoike family moved from regional production to managing financial accounts for the shogunate itself. These were not isolated success stories. They represented a systemic transfer, wealth flowing from rice-denominated stipends at the top of the social hierarchy to cash-denominated accounts near the bottom. If you find this kind of economic history valuable, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week we trace the financial mechanisms that shaped civilizations, because the structural patterns, it turns out, tend to repeat. By the 1850s, when American Commodore Matthew Perry's naval vessels arrived in Edo Bay demanding that Japan open its ports to foreign trade, the Tokugawa shogunate was not simply facing a diplomatic challenge. It was facing an existential crisis in an already weakened state. Financial weakness had limited the ability of many domains to adapt, modernize, and equip themselves effectively. The capacity of the warrior class to respond to external pressure had been constrained not by lack of courage, but by decades of fiscal exhaustion. Here is the central insight this history reveals. The samurai did not lose power because they became inferior fighters. Many individual samurai remained skilled warriors through the end of the Edo period. They lost power because the economic system that funded their existence had been quietly transferred to someone else. Power in any complex society does not reside exclusively in the capacity for force. It resides in the control of resources. The samurai's social authority was always dependent on the rice system, on the assumption that controlling land meant controlling income. But when the relevant economy shifted from rice to cash, from rural production to urban commerce, the samurai were left holding claims on an asset that was declining in relative importance. The merchants, by contrast, held claims on cash flows in a world that increasingly ran on liquidity, credit, and financial intermediation. And in that world, obligations compound in ways that rice allocations simply cannot match. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, which formally ended the Tokugawa shogunate and abolished the samurai class as a legal institution, is often framed as a political revolution. In economic terms, it was also a recognition of something that had already occurred. Much of the samurai class was under severe financial strain well before that moment. The formal abolition of stipends and the dismantling of the feudal class system were politically transformative, but they were also, in a certain sense, the official acknowledgement of what decades of compounding debt had already accomplished. There is a broader principle embedded in this history worth naming directly. Every ruling class derives its authority from control over a particular kind of resource: land, military force, religious legitimacy, industrial capital, or information. The critical variable is not the nature of the resource itself, but the durability of that control in a changing economic environment. The samurai's predicament was not simply financial recklessness. Many individual samurai were disciplined people who found themselves on the wrong side of a structural shift. Their income was fixed in a commodity that was losing relative value. Their expenses were denominated in a currency they did not control. And the gap between those two facts widened, year by year, decade by decade, through the mechanical logic of compounding. A salary that does not adjust to the changing cost of the economy is not stable income. It is a slow erosion made invisible by the assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. The samurai assumed their social position protected them from financial pressure. They discovered, over 250 years, that social standing and financial solvency are entirely separate things, and that the second one, if neglected, will eventually undermine the first. The greatest powers in history were not always brought down by opposing armies. Some were brought down by their own balance sheets, and by the quiet, patient arithmetic of obligations owed to people they once believed they could afford to ignore.